child relationship, it's, you know, it's tough, especially with the older guard, allowing the new guard to flesh those ideas out and try them.
I feared him. That is what the internet wants you to believe, Shane McMahon said. You have probably seen the videos, the clickbait titles everywhere. Shane McMahon names 10 wrestlers he feared. Shane McMahon reveals his biggest nightmares in the ring. The thumbnail shows his face looking shocked. Maybe some dramatic music plays. You click it expecting the truth. But here is what you actually get. A fabricated story, a myth created entirely for views and clicks. The truth? Shane McMahon never officially made that list. He never sat down and ranked 10 wrestlers he feared. The whole thing is invented, made up by content creators desperate for engagement. But before you click away, thinking this video is pointless, wait, because here is the interesting part. The story behind the myth is far more revealing than any fake list could ever be. Shane McMahon is known as one of the most fearless performers in wrestling history. He jumped off steel cages. He fell 50 feet onto concrete. He went through glass panels that were never meant to break. He took bumps that should have killed him. But fear in professional wrestling is not a simple thing. It is not just about being scared of getting hurt. There are layers to it. There is fear of legitimate tough guys who could hurt you for real. There is fear of botching a stunt and embarrassing yourself. Fear of letting down the crowd. Fear of looking weak in front of your peers. And perhaps most importantly, there is the fear that Shane McMahon himself created. The fear of not measuring up to the impossible standard he set. So while Shane never actually named 10 wrestlers he feared in some official capacity, we can name 10 men deeply connected to his career. 10 figures who represent the different types of fear and intimidation that existed around Shane's time in the ring. And what we will uncover is far bigger and more complicated than any clickbait list. If you are enjoying this investigation into wrestling history and want to see more content that digs past the lies, use the hype feature right now and give this video some hype to help us continue exposing the truth. Now let us start by looking at the respect Shane earned early on, before we dive into the problems he created. Shane McMahon walked into professional wrestling with one massive problem hanging over his head like a dark cloud. He was the boss's son. That is it. That is all anyone saw. Fans absolutely hated him for it. They looked at him and saw a spoiled rich kid who got everything handed to him on a silver platter. And you know what? They were not entirely wrong. Shane never worked the territories. He never spent years driving rental cars between small towns. He never slept in cheap motels with 3 other wrestlers. He never wrestled for 50 quid a night hoping to get noticed. He never had to prove himself in bingo halls and high school gymnasiums. He walked straight into the top company in the world because his surname was McMahon. That is privilege, pure and simple. The crowd let him know exactly how they felt. They chanted horrible things at him. They mocked him relentlessly. They questioned his toughness. They questioned his authenticity. They made it very clear he had not earned his spot. His early character was designed to lean directly into this perception. The spoiled rich kid accompanied by the Mean Street Posse. Remember them? They were his preppy bodyguards who fought his battles for him. The character portrayed Shane as a coward, a wealthy boy who relied on others for protection, someone who would run away from a real fight. This worked as a character, but Shane knew this perception was absolute poison if it extended beyond the character into reality. If the locker room saw him as just another corporate executive playing wrestler, he would never be respected, never be accepted, never be seen as one of them. And in wrestling, that matters more than almost anything else. So Shane made a calculated choice, a choice that would define his entire career. He would prove himself through pain, through sacrifice, through taking bumps nobody else would dare take. The locker room culture in professional wrestling values one thing above absolutely everything else: physical sacrifice. You prove you belong by what you are willing to suffer. Veterans talk constantly about earning a standing ovation from the boys in the back. That is described as the ultimate reward, not the cheers from fans in the arena, not the money in your bank account, not even winning championships, but the respect from your peers in the locker room. That knowing nod from a veteran who watched you bleed. Shane McMahon craved that validation desperately. He needed it more than air. His entire sense of self-worth became tied to it, so he started taking insane bumps. Spots that made absolutely no sense for someone in his position. He did not need to wrestle. He already had a corporate salary. He already had an ownership stake in the company. His financial future was secure regardless, but he did it anyway. He put his body on the line again and again. And here is where the criticism truly starts. Here is where we shift from admiring his bravery to questioning his judgment, because Shane's need for validation quickly became something dark. darker, something more reckless and self-destructive. It stopped being about proving he belonged. It became about constantly pushing limits, about outdoing everyone around him, about making absolutely certain that nobody could ever call him soft again, about proving over and over that he was willing to go further than anyone. That sounds noble on the surface. It sounds like the ultimate work ethic, but it created very real and very serious problems for everyone else in the company, problems that still affect wrestling today. Let us talk about the massive elephant in the room that nobody ever mentions in these feel-good stories about Shane's bravery, the fundamental unfairness of his situation compared to everyone else. Shane McMahon wrestled 3 to 6 matches per year during his active period, maybe slightly more during his absolute peak, but that was it. Meanwhile, full-time professional wrestlers worked 150 to 250 matches every single year. Some worked even more than that. They performed 5 nights a week minimum, house shows in small towns nobody has ever heard of, television tapings, pay-per-views, international tours. There was no off-season, no summer break, no time to rest and recover properly. These wrestlers were on the road constantly, away from their families, destroying their bodies night after night. An injury for a full-time wrestler was not just physically painful, it was complete financial disaster. Miss a few weeks and your push is dead. Your storyline is dropped. Your momentum is killed. Someone else takes your spot on the card. You might never get that opportunity back. The business moves fast. If you are not there, you are forgotten. Now let us compare that to Shane McMahon's reality. Shane took a massive bump at a major pay-per-view, something spectacular that got people talking. Then what happened? He flew home on a private jet, corporate transport arranged just for him. He rested at home for months with access to the best medical care money could buy. He had a salary that did not depend on him wrestling even a single match. His position in the company was secured by blood, not performance. He could afford to be a daredevil because he only had to do it once every few months. The recovery time was built in. The financial safety net was always there. Full-time wrestlers looked at this situation and felt real heat. Not the good storyline heat, not the kind that makes money, but genuine resentment and frustration. They saw the unfairness clearly. Shane was stealing their thunder. That is what veterans said behind closed doors. He was raising the bar to completely impossible levels. Think about the psychology of it. If the boss's son jumps 50 feet off scaffolding, how do you say no to a dangerous spot? How do you refuse without looking like a coward? If Shane goes through plate glass, how do you turn down a hardcore match? You simply cannot. Not without looking weak, not without looking uncommitted, not without looking like you do not have the heart for the business. Shane's fearlessness inadvertently forced everyone else to take bigger and bigger risks, to push their bodies further, to say yes to spots they knew were dangerous, because the standard had been set by ownership. And here is the ethical problem that makes this whole thing uncomfortable. Shane did not face the same consequences. He fell 50 feet at SummerSlam. Everyone cheered his bravery. But what if Steve Blackman had taken that exact same fall and gotten seriously hurt? His career stalls immediately. His push evaporates. He becomes just another injured wrestler waiting for clearance. But Shane's executive position stayed completely secure regardless of injury. That is the luxury Shane operated with. One-off brutality. He could structure entire matches around a single spectacular moment, build everything toward one death-defying stunt. Full-time wrestlers could not afford that approach. They had to work complete matches night after night. They could not afford to nearly kill themselves for one spot because they had to perform again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. But Shane could. He had months to recover, and that fundamental difference devalued what everyone else was doing. It made their nightly sacrifices seem less important because Shane's occasional spectacular moments got all the attention. This brings us to the core of this video, the 10 men. The figures connected to Shane McMahon's career who embody different types of fear in professional wrestling. We will go through them in descending order, not because Shane ever ranked them himself, but because each one reveals a different piece of this complicated puzzle, a different layer of what fear actually means in this business. And more importantly, what Shane's stunts truly cost everyone else. Number 10, Roman Reigns. Let us start with Roman Reigns. Now, Reigns never had a major program with Shane. They were not rivals. They barely interacted. But Reigns represents something crucial to the story. He represents the environment Shane helped create. WrestleMania 34, the main event, Brock Lesnar versus Roman Reigns. The match was poorly received by the crowd. Fans were frustrated, hostile. They had seen everything before. And this connects directly back to Shane's legacy. Because by that point, audiences had been conditioned to expect constant escalation. They had seen Shane fall 50 feet. They had watched him jump off Hell in a Cell. They had witnessed him go through glass multiple times. So when Reigns and Lesnar had what would normally be considered a brutal match, it was not enough. The bar was too high. Expectations had been raised beyond reason. Shane helped create that problem. By constantly pushing boundaries and normalizing death-defying stunts, violence, he made regular wrestling seem boring by comparison. Audiences became desensitized. They wanted more danger, more risk, more spectacular moments. And they wanted it because performers like Shane had trained them to expect it. Wrestlers like Roman Reigns suffered because of this. They were judged against an impossible standard. Their normal, hard-hitting matches felt underwhelming because fans had seen executives jump off buildings. This created pressure, terrible pressure on full-time performers. They felt they had to match Shane's stunts. They had to top him somehow. Otherwise, they were not committed enough, not hardcore enough, not willing to sacrifice enough. That is a toxic standard. It leads to unnecessary injuries, shortened careers, permanent damage. Wrestlers sacrificing their health, not because they genuinely want to, but because they feel they have no other choice if they want to stay relevant. Reigns also represents the chaos and frustration backstage, the politics, the pressure from management to deliver increasingly spectacular moments. Shane's legacy loomed over all of it. He had set the bar, and now everyone else had to live with the consequences. That is the lasting damage we will explore throughout this video. Number 9, Mick Foley. Mick Foley never directly wrestled Shane McMahon in any significant program, but Foley is absolutely essential to understanding the story. Foley is famous for brutal matches that destroyed his body, falls from steel cages, thumbtacks embedded in his skin, barbed wire, chair shots to the head. He put himself through absolute hell. His body is permanently damaged because of what he did. But here is the critical difference that changes everything. Mick Foley did it out of desperate necessity. He was not from a wealthy family. He did not have connections. He was not guaranteed anything. Foley had to stand out in a crowded locker room. His body was his only real currency, his only way to get noticed. Every brutal bump was essentially a bet on his future. He hoped the sacrifice would lead to a better contract, more opportunities, main event spots, financial security for his family. Foley's brutality came from a place of survival, of needing to provide, of having no other options available. Shane McMahon's brutality was pure choice. He already had money, more money than Foley would ever make from wrestling. He had a corporate salary that paid him regardless. He had an ownership stake in the company worth millions. He did not need to wrestle even once. His future was completely secure. But he chose to take the same kinds of horrific bumps that Foley did. He chose to put his body through trauma. And that makes Shane's actions deeply unsettling when you really think about it. Because it was not about survival. It was not about feeding his family. It was about ego, about validation, about proving something to people who frankly should not have needed proof. Foley's sacrifices feel tragic. They feel like the desperate actions of a man with no other way forward. Shane's sacrifices feel unnecessary, self-indulgent even, like a rich person playing at being poor. This comparison highlights the moral problem at the heart of Shane's career. Shane could have used his platform differently. He could have used his influence to promote safer wrestling, to protect performers, to push back against the culture of excessive risk-taking. Instead, he did the opposite. He used his privilege to push limits further, to make dangerous bumps seem normal, to set standards that regular wrestlers could not safely meet. That is not leadership. That is recklessness. And the industry is still dealing with the consequences of that choice. Number 8, Kane enters this list because of Shane McMahon's dangerous lack of control in the ring. The research specifically mentions Shane legitimately injuring people through stiff strikes, broken noses, profuse bleeding. These were not worked injuries for storylines. These were real injuries caused by Shane's inability to properly execute safe wrestling maneuvers. Kane was on the receiving end of Shane's unintentional stiffness, and this created a very specific type of fear. Not fear of someone who is legitimately tough, but fear of complete unpredictability. Fear of working with someone who does not know what they are doing. When you step into a ring with a trained professional, there is trust. You know they will pull their punches. You know they understand how to make things look devastating without actually hurting you. That is the art of professional wrestling. But with Shane, that trust did not exist. Performers never knew if they were getting a worked punch or a real one. They had to stay constantly alert, constantly guarding themselves. They could not relax for even a second because Shane might accidentally hurt them. That is incredibly dangerous. It means you cannot trust your opponent. It means every moment in the ring carries real risk. Kane was a seasoned veteran, someone who absolutely knew how to protect himself, but even he got caught by Shane's sloppy strikes. Why? Because Shane was not properly trained. He relied entirely on his name and his position to get away with being unsafe. And here is the really problematic part. Nobody could correct him. If Kane or anyone else complained about Shane's stiffness, what would happen? Nothing. Shane was the owner's son. He was untouchable. Criticizing him could cost you your job. That power imbalance made him dangerous in a completely different way than someone like Haku. Haku was dangerous because he was legitimately tough. Shane was dangerous because he was protected by nepotism. That is not earning respect through toughness. That is abusing power and privilege. Big difference. Number 7, Brock Lesnar, WrestleMania 34. A backstage backstage incident that perfectly illustrates Shane McMahon's limitations and his inability to recognize them. The main event that night was Brock Lesnar defending the Universal Championship against Roman Reigns. The match was poorly received. The crowd was hostile. Nothing clicked. After the match ended, Lesnar returned to the gorilla position. That is the backstage area directly behind the entrance curtain, where Vince McMahon and other officials monitor the show. Lesnar, clearly unhappy with something, tossed the Universal Championship belt directly at Vince McMahon. This was a gesture of extreme disrespect, a physical action that challenged Vince's authority in front of everyone backstage. Shane McMahon witnessed this incident. According to reports, he was immediately hot, furious. His protective instincts kicked in. He attempted to go after Brock Lesnar to confront him physically. This is where producers and other officials stepped in. People like Brian James had to physically stop Shane and strongly advise him to stay back. Why did they stop him? Because Brock Lesnar is not just a wrestler. He is a former UFC heavyweight champion, one of the most legitimately dangerous human beings in professional sports. Lesnar has proven he can hurt people in genuine combat. Shane McMahon, despite all his bravery and bumps, stood absolutely no chance in a real fight against someone like Lesnar. Not even close. This incident is incredibly revealing about Shane's character and his blind spots. Shane had the impulse to defend his father's honor. That is admirable in isolation. It shows loyalty and courage on some level, but it was also profoundly reckless and foolish. Lesnar was not someone you confronted unless you genuinely wanted a real fight. A fight you would lose badly. Shane's ego told him he could handle it. His track record of taking dangerous bumps made him feel tough. But there is a massive difference between taking a choreographed stunt and fighting a trained combat athlete. Shane only wrestled a few times per year. He thought that made him battle-tested. But compared to someone like Brock Lesnar who lived and breathed combat sports, Shane was an amateur, a corporate executive playing tough guy. Lesnar was legitimate. Shane was performative. The producers understood this distinction clearly. Shane apparently did not want to admit it. This reveals the uncomfortable truth behind all of Shane's fearlessness. It worked in carefully planned matches with predetermined outcomes. It worked when he controlled the variables. But against a genuinely dangerous person in an unscripted situation, he had no chance. The entire foundation of his tough guy image was built on stunts, not legitimate fighting ability, and that is fine. Wrestling is performance. But Shane seemed to believe his own mythology. He seemed to think the bumps he took made him equal to real fighters. They did not. Number 6. The Undertaker WrestleMania 32. Hell in a Cell. Shane McMahon versus The Undertaker. This match was built around one spot and essentially one spot alone. Shane jumping from the top of the 20-foot cell through an announce table below. The match itself has been heavily criticized by fans and analysts. Two aging performers. Nearly 50 minutes of ring time, both struggling to maintain any kind of acceptable pace. Many people have called it a parody of the classic Undertaker Hell in a Cell matches. A pale imitation that exposed the limitations of both performers. The technical wrestling was lacking. The storytelling was confused. The length was punishing. But the match happened anyway because of the relationship between the two men. Shane McMahon and Mark Calloway, The Undertaker's real name, were best friends. Their bond stretched back to the early 1990s. It was built on genuine trust, mutual respect, and a commitment to looking out for each other. That deep friendship allowed them to collaborate on this match. They knew each other's limits. They trusted each other completely. And that trust was necessary because the match required Shane to take that jump from the cell. 20 feet straight down through a table. It was a callback to classic Undertaker moments. An attempt to create another WrestleMania memory. The fear in this context was not fear of each other. Undertaker was not going to intentionally hurt Shane. Shane trusted Undertaker with his life. The fear here was completely different. It was fear of failing to live up to the legendary WrestleMania moment standard. Fear of disappointing the fans. Fear of tarnishing Undertaker's legacy. Fear of being remembered as the match that proved Shane should have stayed in the office. Both men felt that pressure. They wanted desperately to deliver something memorable, something people would talk about for years. And they succeeded in one sense. People do remember the match. They remember the jump, but they also remember it dragging on forever. They remember it being technically poor. They remember feeling underwhelmed despite the spectacular dive. This highlights the fundamental problem with Shane's entire approach to wrestling. His matches were never really about wrestling. They were about the big spot, the one moment everyone would talk about the next day. Everything else was just filler leading up to that moment. There was no psychology, no story being told through holds and counters, just killing time until the crazy bump happened. That approach approach completely devalues the craft of professional wrestling. It tells the audience that wrestling itself does not matter, that technique does not matter, that storytelling does not matter. Only the stunt matters, only the spectacle. The Undertaker is legitimately one of the greatest performers in wrestling history, a master storyteller, someone who understood psychology better than almost anyone. But even he could not make this match work properly. Why? Because Shane's style does not build compelling stories. It builds highlight reels, moments designed for YouTube clips. The rest is irrelevant, and that is terrible for wrestling as an art form. It reduces everything to shock value. It trains audiences to only care about crazy bumps. Technical wrestling gets devalued. Mat work gets ignored. The craft dies. That is Shane's legacy, not fearlessness, but the death of wrestling as anything more than stunt work. Number 5. Kurt Angle, King of the Ring, 2001. The glass spot. This is the single clearest and most definitive example of Shane McMahon's reckless mindset. The match was billed as a street fight between Shane and Olympic gold medalist Kurt Angle. The plan involved a spectacular spot. Angle would suplex Shane through large glass panels that formed part of the stage entrance set. In professional wrestling, you use specially prepared materials for safety. Glass panels are typically made of sugar glass or breakaway glass. This material shatters very easily with minimal force and does not produce the deadly shards that real glass creates. It looks dangerous but is relatively safe for trained stunt performers. That is the standard. That is how you protect people. But at King of the Ring 2001, multiple failures occurred that created a perfect storm of danger. The wrong glass was ordered or delivered by the stunt coordinator. Multiple layers of paint used for corporate branding inadvertently reinforced the glass panels, increasing their structural integrity dramatically. Sugar glass was specifically avoided because of entrance pyrotechnics that could melt the material. All of these factors combined resulted in panels that were essentially reinforced plexiglass or possibly even actual glass. Unyielding, dangerous, completely wrong for the planned spot. Kurt Angle threw Shane McMahon against the glass panel as planned, but it did not break. Instead, Shane's head bounced violently off the unyielding surface. His skull hit the concrete floor behind it with what witnesses described as a sickening thud, a sound people could not forget. Shane was immediately concussed, visibly loopy, disoriented, not fully aware of where he was. Any rational person would have stopped the match right there, called for medical attention, protected the performer from further damage. That would have been the smart, responsible decision. But Shane McMahon insisted on continuing, despite being concussed, despite the danger being completely obvious. He told Kurt Angle to put him through that window right now, ordered him to try again, to finish the spot no matter what. Kurt Angle, who was wrestling with a fractured tailbone the entire match, tried again. He kept throwing Shane at the glass. Eventually, after multiple attempts, the panels finally broke. Shane went through in a shower of glass. He was cut badly, blood everywhere. He ended up requiring 50 to 60 stitches to close his lacerations. Both men were hospitalized immediately after the match. The injuries were severe, potentially life-threatening, and the backstage reaction was telling. Vince McMahon spent the entire match shouting into the referee's earpiece to stop the performance, to call it off, to protect his son from himself. But Shane claims he never heard those instructions because he had been knocked in the head. His brain was not working properly, and yet he kept going. This single moment encapsulates everything wrong with Shane McMahon's entire career. It was not about proving he belonged anymore. That ship had sailed years ago. This was about completing the spectacle no matter what, even if it resulted in permanent brain damage, even if it killed him. That is not bravery. That is not heart. That is dangerous obsession. It is mental illness disguised as toughness. And it set a truly terrible standard for everyone watching, because now every single wrestler in the company saw that refusing to finish a dangerous spot was considered weakness, even when the spot was actively failing, even when continuing could cause permanent disability or death. Shane would rather die than look soft. And that insane mindset trickled down to the entire locker room. Suddenly, saying no to a dangerous spot made you look like you had no heart, like you were not committed to the business. Shane did not just risk his own life with this decision. He raised the stakes for every single performer in the company. He created a culture where stopping for safety was seen as cowardice, where protecting yourself was considered weakness. That is horrifically irresponsible. It is the opposite of leadership, and wrestlers are still dealing with the consequences of that culture today. The pressure to work through injuries, to finish spots that are clearly going wrong, to never show weakness no matter what. Shane did not invent all of that, but he certainly made it much worse. He normalized genuinely insane levels of risk-taking, and people got hurt because of it. Number 4, Steve Blackman, SummerSlam 2000, the 50-foot fall. This remains Shane McMahon's most famous and most celebrated moment. He fought Steve Blackman for the Hardcore Championship in a match that defined Shane's entire wrestling philosophy. The match built toward a chase up the massive entrance scaffolding. Both men climbed high higher and higher. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. They knew something spectacular was coming. Steve Blackman struck Shane with a kendo stick while they were at the very top of the structure. Shane fell backwards, 50 feet down, plummeting through the air. He crashed onto the stage below. The stage had been gimmicked with crash pads disguised to look like normal flooring. But even with professional padding, a 50-foot fall is extraordinarily dangerous. At an impact velocity approaching 40 miles per hour, any error in body orientation could result in spinal compression, paralysis, or death. The margin for error is essentially non-existent. Shane survived. The crowd erupted. It looked absolutely spectacular. Steve Blackman later gave interviews praising Shane's bravery. He said Shane was leading by example, showing the entire roster that company ownership was not asking them to do anything the owners would not do themselves. That sounds wonderful. It sounds like the perfect example of leadership. But let us be completely honest about the reality beneath that feel-good story. If Steve Blackman had taken that exact same fall and gotten seriously injured, what would have happened to his career? His push would have been immediately derailed. His momentum would have evaporated overnight. He would have been just another injured wrestler waiting for medical clearance, possibly replaced in his current storyline, possibly forgotten entirely by the time he healed. His entire career trajectory could have been permanently altered by that injury. But if Shane got hurt from that same fall, his executive salary would have continued without interruption. His ownership stake in the company would have remained completely secure. His position would not have changed at all. He would have recovered at home with access to the absolute best medical care money could buy. And he would have returned to television whenever he felt ready. That is not equal risk. That is not the same sacrifice. That is privilege dressed up in the costume of courage. Shane could afford to be reckless in a way that Steve Blackman simply could not. Bravery is easier when you have a comprehensive safety net beneath you. Full-time wrestlers did not have that safety net. They walked a tightrope every single night. One slip meant disaster. Shane walked the tightrope once every few months. Then he flew home on a private jet to rest in comfort. Yet Shane received all the credit for being fearless, all the praise for his sacrifice. And sure, the fall was legitimately dangerous. He absolutely could have died. But the consequences of injury were completely different for him than for everyone else. That fundamental unfairness never gets discussed. Steve Blackman had to return to work immediately. He had matches scheduled. He had to travel to the next city. He had to perform through pain. Shane had no such obligations. He could rest as long as necessary. That makes their sacrifice completely incomparable. Number 3, Vader Big Van Vader. Leon White, a monster of a man with a terrifying reputation for being dangerously stiff in the ring. Vader was known throughout the industry for throwing legitimate strikes, for hitting people for real. He broke noses regularly, caused serious head injuries. His matches with Mick Foley are legendary for their brutality. Many wrestlers genuinely feared working with Vader. They knew they would be physically battered during the encounter. They knew they would go home hurt. Vader's stiffness was sometimes intentional. Sometimes it was just his style. But either way, it created real fear. Shane McMahon's own in-ring style has been frequently compared to Vader's in terms of unintentional stiffness. Critics and other wrestlers have pointed out that Shane's punches were consistently sloppy and reckless. They often landed legitimately. They caused real injuries. Why? Because Shane lacked the professional training to properly work a strike safely. He did not spend years learning how to make contact look devastating while pulling the actual impact. He just threw punches. Sometimes they connected for real. Sometimes they hurt people. And this created a secondary type of fear. The fear of working with an untrained performer who simply does not know what he is doing. But here is where Shane's situation becomes far more problematic than Vader's. If Vader hurt you, at least you could complain to management. You could voice your concerns. Other wrestlers could back you up. There might be consequences. Vader might be told to work safer. He might be warned. There was some level of accountability. With Shane McMahon, there was none. Complaining about Shane could cost you your career. He was the owner's son. He was untouchable by anyone in the company. That power imbalance made him dangerous in a completely unique way. He was untrained but completely protected, stiff but immune to consequences. That is an incredibly toxic combination. Wrestlers had to work with Shane and just accept his sloppy, dangerous strikes. They had to sell for him. They had to make him look good. They had to pretend everything was fine even when they got legitimately hurt, because challenging him was career suicide. Speaking up meant risking your job. That is not how professional wrestling should work. That is not earning respect through toughness or skill. That is straight up abuse of power, using your family name and corporate position to get away with being unsafe. And nobody could stop it. Nobody could correct him. The normal rules did not apply because of who his father was. That created an environment of fear, but not the respect-based fear that comes from working with legitimately tough people like Haku. This was fear based purely on power and nepotism. Fear of retaliation. Fear of losing your livelihood if you spoke the truth. That is completely different. Number Number 2, Ken Shamrock. Ken Shamrock arrived in WWE as the world's most dangerous man. This was not just a nickname, this was reality. Shamrock was a legitimate pioneer of mixed martial arts. He brought a completely different style of physicality to professional wrestling. His background was in real fighting, submission grappling, ground and pound. This created intense difficulty for traditional professional wrestlers who were used to cooperative choreography. Shamrock's submission style was inherently stiff and unpredictable. He did not always work the gentle, cooperative style that professional wrestling requires. His intensity was unlike anything most performers had experienced. Shane McMahon's involvement with Ken Shamrock was strategic. Shane was often used as a physical prop in angles involving Shamrock. The most notable example occurred when Vince McMahon used his own son Shane as a human shield to escape Shamrock's wrath. Vince literally hid behind Shane. Shamrock, in his rage, grabbed Shane and suplexed him violently. Shane took the move for his father's cowardice. This kind of angle was perfect for Shane's purposes. It allowed him to signal to the entire roster that he was willing to be physically in the ring with the world's most dangerous legitimate fighters. It chipped away at the silver spoon stigma. It showed he would put himself in harm's way. But again, let us examine the context and the unfairness. Shane chose to work with Shamrock. This was not forced on him. He was not randomly assigned to a program he did not want. It was a calculated decision designed to boost his credibility. And after that suplex, after that angle ended, Shane went home to recover in comfort. Shamrock continued wrestling night after night. Shamrock maintained his insane schedule while Shane rested. That pattern repeats throughout Shane's career. Strategic appearances designed to maximize credibility while minimizing actual risk. Smart from a personal standpoint, deeply unfair from a locker room perspective. Shamrock himself claimed he never intentionally shot on opponents. He said he never deliberately hurt people, but his intensity was such that wrestlers were constantly nervous. They were constantly aware that Shamrock could legitimately end a match at any moment if something went wrong. If he got angry, if he felt disrespected, that underlying tension created fear. Shane positioning himself in angles with Shamrock was brave, but it was also calculated. Another piece of his carefully managed image as someone willing to work with dangerous people. The reality was always more controlled than it appeared. Number 1, Haku. We have finally reached number 1, and this is not remotely surprising to anyone familiar with wrestling history. Haku, also known as Mung, is universally regarded by his peers as the single most terrifying individual to ever step foot inside a professional wrestling ring. His reputation is completely unmatched. Ask any veteran wrestler to name the toughest person they ever met. The answer is always Haku. Always. The stories are legendary and numerous. Bar fights where Haku destroyed multiple attackers. Accounts of his extraordinary physical strength. His complete lack of hesitation when engaging in real altercations. His willingness to violently protect the business from disrespectful outsiders. Haku's reputation was not built on wrestling performance. It was built on legitimate real-world violence. Shane McMahon admitted in interviews that meeting Haku was a genuinely nerve-wracking experience. He said that Haku's reputation ate him alive in the brain. Just think about that statement for a moment. Shane McMahon is the son of Vince McMahon, the heir to the entire WWE empire. He technically employed Haku. He was Haku's boss in the corporate structure, but he was absolutely terrified of meeting him. Why? Because in the actual hierarchy of the locker room, corporate titles meant absolutely nothing. Haku's physical dominance was complete and total. Everyone knew it. Everyone respected it. Even the boss's son. The dynamic between Shane McMahon and Haku was one of extreme deference. Shane understood instinctively that this was not someone you gave orders to. This was not someone you disrespected. This was not someone you challenged in any way. Haku could have destroyed Shane without breaking a sweat, and there would have been nothing Shane could have done about it. No amount of money or family connections would have protected him from Haku if things went wrong. That created genuine fear, real intimidation, not the performance kind, the survival instinct kind. Shane's respect for Haku deepened significantly when they actually worked together in the ring. Haku made Shane look like $1,000,000 during their encounters. He protected Shane. He made sure their matches worked. He signaled professional acceptance of Shane, and that meant absolutely everything to Shane. It was validation from a living legend, a signal that Shane had somehow earned his place despite the nepotism. But let us flip this around and look at it from another angle. Shane deliberately used his position to work with the industry's most dangerous men. This was part of his strategy. He could say he worked with Haku. He could borrow that legitimacy. He could associate himself with Haku's toughness. Most wrestlers did not have that luxury. They worked with whoever they were assigned to work with. They did not get to carefully select opponents who would boost their credibility. Shane picked his spots strategically. He picked opponents carefully. That is yet another advantage his position provided. He was not just randomly proving himself. He was carefully managing his image and reputation. Working with Haku was brave, absolutely, but it was also calculated. Another piece of his carefully constructed tough guy persona. The reality is that Shane's entire career was about optics, about being seen as legitimate, and working with men like Haku helped create that perception. But it was always more controlled than it appeared, always more strategic. Shane had advantages nobody else had, and he used them brilliantly. Now let us return to where we started. The myth of the top 10 list. Shane McMahon never officially made such a ranking. That is established fact, but these clickbait videos and articles exist for a reason. People desperately want to believe in these stories. They want to think Shane feared these legends. Why? Because it makes him more relatable, more human, more like us. If even Shane McMahon, the fearless daredevil, was scared of some people, then maybe he is not so different after all. But the actual truth is far more complicated than any simple list could ever capture. Shane McMahon did not fear people in the traditional sense. What he feared was irrelevance, being forgotten, being seen as nothing more than the boss's son who never earned his place. That fear drove everything he did, every insane bump, every dangerous stunt, every death-defying fall. He was fighting that fear constantly, fighting to prove his legitimacy, and he fought by taking risks that should have killed him, by working with the toughest men in the business, by pushing his body far past any reasonable limit. That approach earned him tremendous respect. Veterans gave him standing ovations. They admired his willingness to bleed. They acknowledged his courage. But respect is not the whole story. Not even close. Shane McMahon's career fundamentally changed the wrestling industry, but not always for the better. In many ways, not even mostly for the better. He shifted what was considered acceptable in mainstream professional wrestling. Before Shane became a regular in-ring performer, spots like his were reserved exclusively for hardcore specialists. Mick Foley in death matches, the Dudley Boys putting people through tables, Jeff Hardy diving off ladders. These were niche performers doing niche things. After Shane, after his 50-foot falls and glass spots, everyone was suddenly expected to take similar risks. Because if a corporate executive could do these things, why couldn't professional wrestlers? That question haunted every locker room. It created enormous pressure and an ethical nightmare. If the boss's son willingly jumps off a Hell in a Cell, how does a mid-card performer justify saying no to a dangerous spot? How do you refuse without looking weak, without looking uncommitted? You simply cannot. Not in that environment. That is the fear Shane created. Not fear of him personally, but fear of being viewed as lesser compared to the impossible standard he set. Fear of losing your spot because you were not willing to risk your life the way Shane did. That is toxic. That is not leadership. That creates an environment where people get hurt unnecessarily, where careers end prematurely, where permanent damage accumulates because saying no is not really an option. Shane's status as a non-wrestler performing these spectacular feats also fundamentally devalued technical wrestling artistry. Think about what it communicates to audiences. If a corporate executive who wrestles 3 times a year can replicate the most famous moments of legendary performers, what does that say about professional wrestling as a craft? It suggests that wrestling itself is secondary to spectacle. That technique does not really matter. That storytelling is not important. That psychology is irrelevant. All that matters is the big stunt, the shocking moment, the thing that makes people gasp. This spectacle-first approach has been directly blamed for the rise of spot-heavy wrestling, matches where narrative structure is completely sacrificed for sequences of dangerous moves designed to go viral on social media. Dangerous falls that get clicks and views but tell no story. Shane did not invent this trend alone, but he absolutely accelerated it. He made it mainstream, he normalized it, and the wrestling industry is still dealing with that legacy decades later. There is also the economic dimension that cannot be ignored. Shane McMahon's privilege allowed him to take risks that full-time wrestlers physically could not. He had private jets to travel in comfort, a corporate executive salary that paid regardless of wrestling, an ownership stake worth millions, time to recover properly between matches, access to the absolute best medical care available. Full-time professional wrestlers had none of these advantages. They wrestled through constant pain. They traveled in rental cars. They flew commercial. They worried constantly about money if injuries forced time off. Shane never worried about money once in his entire life. That made his fearlessness fundamentally easier. It was not true fearlessness in the same way. It was fearlessness with a comprehensive safety net. That is not the same thing at all. Yet Shane received universal credit and praise as if he was taking equal risks to everyone else, as if his sacrifices were equivalent to those of full-time performers. That is profoundly unfair. It diminishes the genuine sacrifices of wrestlers who did not have his advantages, who were truly risking everything every single night, who had no backup plan if things went wrong. Shane always had a backup plan. He always had security. He always had the family business to fall back on. That context matters enormously. It changes the entire narrative. The 10 wrestlers we named today, Roman Reigns, Mick Foley, Kane, Kane, Brock Lesnar, The Undertaker, Kurt Angle, Steve Blackman, Vader, Ken Shamrock, and Haku. Each one connects to different aspects of Shane McMahon's complicated career. Some represent legitimate intimidation from truly dangerous men. Some represent carefully engineered danger that went horribly wrong. Some represent the toxic culture and impossible standards Shane created. Together, they paint a complete picture. A picture of a man desperately trying to prove himself. A man willing to destroy his body for validation and acceptance. But also a man whose enormous privilege protected him from the worst consequences of his choices. A man whose recklessness set standards that hurt everyone else. Shane McMahon earned respect. That is completely undeniable. Veterans did give him standing ovations. They genuinely admired his willingness to bleed and suffer. They acknowledged his courage and heart. But respect is not the complete story. It is not even most of the story. The complete story includes the resentment, the unfairness, the pressure he created, the culture he shaped, the safety standards he eroded, the technical artistry he devalued, the careers that were shortened because of the standards he set. That is all part of his legacy too. You cannot separate the good from the bad. You cannot take the respect without acknowledging the damage. Shane McMahon's career was a 20-year pursuit of a single goal: to be seen and accepted as a wrestler instead of just an owner, to be one of the boys instead of the boss's son. He achieved that goal. He absolutely did. But the cost was extraordinarily high. His health suffered tremendously. Multiple surgeries, countless stitches, extended recovery periods, permanent damage to his body, and the wrestling industry's safety culture fundamentally shifted. Standards changed. Expectations rose to dangerous levels. Wrestlers took bigger risks because Shane set the bar so incredibly high. Full-time performers felt enormous pressure to match his stunts, even though they lacked his advantages. That is the complicated legacy Shane left behind. Shane McMahon is simultaneously hero and problem, brave and reckless, admired and resented, respected and criticized. Whether you personally view him as a fearless warrior or a privileged risk-taker depends entirely on your perspective, on what you choose to emphasize, on which parts of the story you focus on. But one thing is absolutely certain and cannot be disputed. Shane McMahon's career was never just about him. It was never just his personal journey. It was about the message he sent to everyone else, the culture he shaped and influenced, the standards he normalized, the price that everyone else paid for his validation. That is the real story behind the top 10 list that never actually existed. The truth is bigger than any ranking. It is about what fear means in professional wrestling, what sacrifice means, what privilege means, and what happens when the boss's son decides he needs to prove he belongs by nearly killing himself repeatedly. The consequences echo through the industry even today, and they will continue echoing for years to come. That is Shane McMahon's true legacy.